Good afternoon, everyone. This is Christina Osborne with ISO's Stakeholder Engagement Team, and I'd like to welcome you to the meeting to discuss the draft final proposal and draft tariff language for Phase 1 of the Transmission Service and Market Scheduling Priorities Initiative. The proposal, tariff documents, and presentation are posted out on the initiative webpage. So it's not noted on the agenda here, but after I go over the meeting logistics, Anna McKenna, who is ISO's Vice President of Market Policy and Performance, will provide some introductory remarks. And then after that, Milos Bosanek, the policy lead for this initiative, will review the Phase 1 draft final proposal, and then he's going to provide an update on Phase 2 of this initiative. And then Anthony Ivankovich from ISO Legal is going to provide an overview of the draft tariff language. And then finally, sorry, 1 second, my screen went dark. Hold on. Sorry, folks, hold on. Technical issues here. Okay. And then after that, I'm going to go ahead and review the next steps for this initiative at the end of the presentation. There are several other ISO subject matter experts who are assigned to this initiative. They are listed under the panelist window, and they're available to help respond to questions. There will be opportunity to ask questions either verbally or in the chat. I'll go ahead and provide instructions for how to raise your hand at that time. We are recording the meeting, and we'll post the video file out on the initiative webpage for informational and convenience purposes only. Please contact the ISO before reprinting any related transcriptions. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the meeting over to Anna McKenna.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our stakeholder meeting on Transmission Service and Market Scheduling Priorities Initiative. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to thank you all for being here today, but also for participating in all the stakeholder initiatives that we've had over this past year. It's been a very busy year, and on behalf of the ISO, the entire ISO team, I want to thank you all for participating actively and contributing to the many improvements we've had to make on an expedited basis this past year. You know, we truly appreciate all the input, the dialogue, the information, the feedback we received, and we also very much appreciate your commitment and dedication, which we all share in developing solid market products that further our goals for a cleaner, more reliable grid operations throughout the entire Western Interconnection. So this initiative in particular has given us the opportunity to touch on some very important aspects of how we operate and the implications of our markets and operations on an internal and external stakeholders. And although we are not quite done with this effort, we've learned a lot, and we're well poised to initiate the design of a more durable long-term transmission reservation and market scheduling priority solution. As the West continues to face some supply challenges, reliance on imports to serve load, particularly during summer conditions, is a reality for both the ISO as well as all our external load serving entities. And last summer, after the ISO proposed and FERC approved the interim solution on wheeling that established some wheeling priorities for external entities, we all recognize the need to establish a more durable long-term framework. So you'll hear today that the ISO will be proposing to extend the interim wheeling through priorities framework for another 2 summers. And that extension is an attempt to really balance the need for certainty of the rules to support contracting and wheeling throughout the ISO system ahead of summer, while also retaining the framework that implements certain protections for native load compared to the framework in place back in 2020 during the challenging system conditions. So with that in mind,
actually, I'm sorry to interrupt here. I just wanted to make sure you're still on the agenda slide, right, Christina?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Thank you for confirming. I'm sorry to interrupt. Please go ahead.
Problem. So I was just saying that, you know, with that in mind, with the intent to extend the current framework for 2 summers, We are committed to finalizing policy development of a more durable long-term framework in 2022, and the extension allows us time to consider that more carefully. And our hope is, of course, to have this implemented ahead of summer of 2024. And this timeline allows us to make a FERC filing and get a FERC decision so that we can implement at the end of 2023 to have this go live in 2024. So that is the trajectory of rules related to this issue as we embark on a more durable policy design effort. And I wanted to note that we are very committed for next year to actively engage in this discussion. We hope to leverage what we've learned from our benchmarking with other ISOs and RTOs and other balancing authority areas throughout the West. And we also want to engage and then solicit the input of stakeholders throughout this next effort as we develop a more durable solution. And we hope to be able to establish a regime that supports and bridges and minimizes any seams with other balancing authority areas throughout the West. Again, I want to thank you for participating today and throughout the year. I hope you all have some time to relax, enjoy time with your loved ones over the upcoming holiday period. We at the ISO are all looking forward to a productive year and market policy design in 2022, and we will be prepared to engage in that discussion with all of you, both in this initiative and the many initiatives that we'll be participating in next year. So thank you all and happy holidays. And with that, I turn it back to Christina.
Great. Thank you, Anna. Appreciate it. Next, we have Milos Basanik, who's going to review the details of the Phase 1 draft final proposal. So, Milos?
All right. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Anna. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks again for joining us ahead of the holidays on a Monday afternoon meeting. So we really appreciate it. Today, we're going to discuss the draft final proposal for Phase 1 of the initiative, which really focuses, as Anna noted, on the market scheduling priorities and associated framework ahead of next summer. We have outlined a proposal to extend the interim wheeling through priorities for the next 2 summers that we're going to cover today. And we're also going to discuss the draft tariff language associated with that extension of the framework. And that's the last topic on the agenda today. After we finish going through Phase 1, we're going to turn to an informational update on Phase 2 of the initiative, which really focuses on the development of that longer-term framework, the transmission reservation process for establishing market scheduling priorities. We're going to turn our focus to Phase 2, and we'll share an updated timeline on that initiative, on that phase. And as I go through these next few slides, I'm also going to pause at certain points in the presentation for any questions as we go through each one of the elements of the proposal that was included in the draft final proposal. I'll pause for questions. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay. So this is the main element of the draft final proposal that we're going to be proposing to extend the interim wheeling through priorities framework that was approved by FERC last summer and extending that for the next 2 summers, summer of 2022 and summer of 2023 through June 1 of 2024. So right before the start of summer of 2024. Just as way of background, this past summer, FERC approved the scheduling priorities framework for load, export, and wheeling through the ISO system. But the wheeling through priorities and that framework associated with wheeling through priorities that was filed and approved was approved on an interim basis until June 1st of 2022. And so we're going to be proposing, as part of this proposal, to extend this framework approved by FERC this past summer for those next 2 summers, summer of 2022 and summer of 2023. An extension of this framework really retains the ability for wheeling through transactions to establish high scheduling priority equal to ISO load by meeting certain requirements 45 days in advance of the month in which they're seeking to establish that wheeling through priority. Namely, those entities seeking to establish that priority for wheeling through transactions across the ISO system can do so by demonstrating that they have a contract to serve load outside of the ISO and have secured firm transmission to the ISO border for the duration of the month in which they're seeking that wheeling through priority. And if they meet those requirements, then the wheeling through priority they get is equal to ISO load to the extent that there are any actions that need to be taken in kind of curtailments or schedule adjustments. The framework also then retains the concept of low priority wheeling through transactions, which essentially means that entities that that want to wheel through the ISO system, but maybe are not able to meet the requirements that I noted earlier for establishing that higher priority, those wheel throughs will just have a lower scheduling priority than the high priority wheeling through transactions. And associated with that framework of scheduling priority, the framework also retains the post-HAS process for effectuating the priorities and allocating the limited transmission capacity in stress system conditions. You may recall that this is a new process, this post-HAS allocation process, which luckily has not triggered yet since we implemented it last summer. But in certain limited instances, when this process triggers, that is where the ISO then allocates the limited transmission space across the system or in Path 26 based on scheduling priorities, effectively adjusting or curtailing self-scheduled transactions based on their priority. And high priority wheeling through transactions in those instances have equal priority to RA transactions, resource adequacy transactions, for purposes of effectuating that priority. So that is really where that high priority wheeling through comes into play in particular. Let's go to the next slide, please. Just a little bit on the rationale and our thinking behind the extension of the wheeling through priorities framework. We think that at this stage, the proposal of extending those wheeling through priorities and the associated framework really balances the need to provide certainty of the rules for wheeling through the ISO system ahead of next summer, to support contracting and planning to reliably serve load by external entities, with the continued protections, as Anna said, for serving native loads as compared to summer of 2020 and those priorities as was approved by FERC this past summer. I'll note that we did consider different enhancements based on stakeholder input, including consideration of a simplified reservation process by next summer, the potential ability to establish priority closer in time for wheeling through transactions, but such frameworks really would not allow us adequate time for vetting with stakeholders, nor would there be sufficient time to implement a reservation process by next summer. I think that's just the realities of the crunch in timelines. But also such a framework would, again, change the rules for wheeling through the ISO system ahead of next summer, and it would have an impact on contracting and introducing uncertainty for external entities that are wheeling through independent wheel-throughs across the ISO system. This consideration, the weighing of the different implications, is frankly what caused us to take some additional time on phase one of this initiative and the publication of the draft final proposal as we were evaluating the viability of improvements and implementation aspects. In stakeholder comments, I'll acknowledge that in comments to the issue paper, we heard from a number of stakeholders, particularly external load-serving entities that rely on wheel-throughs through the ISO system to serve load. And we heard the need to provide certainty of rules for wheeling through the ISO system ahead of summer. As parties plan for those next summer conditions and they start contracting, they need certainty as to what the rules are for establishing those scheduling priorities for wheel-throughs across the ISO system. Extension of the framework also retains certain protections for native loads, as I noted, as compared to the summer 2020 priorities, namely ensuring that wheel-through transactions do not have priority above a load transaction. I also want to acknowledge and recognize that we are proposing an extension not just for next summer, but for the next 2 summers. An extension for summer 2022 only, as we looked at it as an extension just for next year or for next summer, would find us back in this position against next year. Looking at timelines realistically, in order to provide certainty for external load-serving entities as to what the rules are for wheeling through the ISO system, in order to support contracting, and to provide notice as to that new framework, we would realistically need to finish a long-term policy design by the start of summer of 2022, and then file with FERC right after that in order to have a decision by the end of summer, and then implement for summer of 2023. This is really a tight timeline, not only from a policy development perspective, but also, it's a tight timeline for development of a process that we're not familiar with, a transmission reservation process and the different concepts that come with it. But also, it's a tight timeline for implementation depending upon the complexity of the framework. So we felt that an extension for the next two summers, summer of 2022 and summer of 2023, would allow us and the stakeholders to dedicate really our attention on policy development of the reservation process under phase 2, but also allows us time for implementation, providing parties with timely notice of the rule changes for establishing those priorities ahead of summer of 2024. We are committed to developing, as Anna said, a reservation process and evaluating the ability to implement such a transmission reservation process ahead of summer of 2024. I'm going to touch on those key elements, and I'm going to provide the informational update on phase 2 a bit later in this presentation. But ultimately, we believe that the extension of this framework that was approved by FERC last summer for wheeling through priorities is a prudent next step in light of the different needs that we heard, and really allows us then to focus on the development of that longer-term framework. Let me pause here then for questions, and then we'll turn to some of the other elements of the draft final proposal, and we'll close this phase 1 discussion with an overview of the timeline, as we're really in the spirit of expediting certain elements of phase 1. We're also going to touch on when we plan to present this topic for decision at the ISO Board of Governors and the EIM governing body meeting next, but that will be in January. So let's pause here for questions before moving on to the next topic, and then we can focus on other aspects of phase 1.
Sure. I do see we have a few hands raised, but just a reminder, if you have joined via WebEx, you're going to select the hand icon above the chat window. If you just dialed into the meeting, you'll need to press #2, or you can also send your question in the chat. And then also, just as a reminder, to state your name and affiliation before asking your question. So let's go to the first person in the queue.
Sure. Caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Michelle Keto from the CPAC. Can you hear me?
Hi, Michelle.
Yes.
Great. Hey, so a couple of questions. So one of which on the previous page, you said you were going to continue with the practice of allowing firm supply contracts with firm transmission. And I just wanted to follow up on that. And I'm struggling with this idea of firm power contracts, given the data that we saw for July, August, and September, where we might have had 1,000 megawatts of reservation, but substantially less actually wheeled. And I'm just trying to understand how that's consistent with a firm power supply contract.
Hi, Michelle. This is Milos. I don't know if any. I don't think it's. I don't want to put any external entities on, to talk necessarily about this, but these entities, we have certain requirements that they have to meet, and they have to meet certain attestations as to the quality of those arrangements, as well as that they have the firm transmission in place. I think what we've seen is that I believe in September or August, we had about 1,000 megawatts or so of high priority wheels registered to essentially have that high priority throughout the month. Not necessarily all of them were scheduled across all the hours, but I envision that in certain instances, as they're optimizing the type of resources that they have to serve loads, they may call on some resources more than others. But I don't see necessarily that is inconsistent with the firm nature of those generation contracts. Ultimately, okay. I think they have the ability to decide when they call on some of these resources, when they, depending on what those load needs are and the conditions are, when they're tagging those different transactions.
Okay, well, I think in September maybe we had 700 megawatts, but only 97 used it. And I just recall the last conversation when we were entering into this. I thought the idea really was a firm power supply contract. We had raised some concerns about these being option contracts. And if you're only using 97 to 700, it does start to look like an option contract. So, okay.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So the other thing is we had put some comments in about wheeling transactions and also exports into our comments, and they weren't addressed in the paper. And one of the questions was, I'm struggling with the information about the wheeling transactions. So it's my understanding that wheels have to be paired. It has to be an import and an export. But if you look at July 9th, none of the wheels, TORs, or ETCs were cut. And I'm struggling with that given that we lost the import capability for the Northwest. So it seems to me that the imports and the exports did become unpaired, and I don't understand why that didn't get reflected. Do you guys, we put it, do you have any thoughts about that? Have you guys gone back to look at that?
Yeah, hey, Michelle, this is Milos again. I think the July data was, and I can turn it to Brad to supplement anything that I note here, but I will recognize that, the new priorities framework went into effect in August, and the July data was this is before that, high priority, low priority wheel concept. But maybe I'll don't know, Brad, if there's anything you want to supplement in terms of the export and the pairing with the import transaction.
So Milos, another point, the idea that the imports and exports needed to be paired for wheels, I don't think that was new with the new tariff language. So that's why just trying to fully understand wheeling and TORs and ETCs. But yeah, if Greg could answer that, that would be great.
This is Brad. I'm not familiar with the specifics of what happened in July, but I know that in July we had the issue with our transmission constraint penalty price that we're addressing. So potentially things had something to do with that, but I'm not familiar with the details. I'm sorry.
And we can look at that, Michelle, and follow up with you as well. We'll write that down here and follow up.
Okay, and then this is that you're proposing that are you saying that what we have right now is just or what we had previously was just and reasonable? I guess I'm struggling with the idea that we put all this effort in changing it because we were concerned about what was in place. We're going to keep it in place for 3 years. I would imagine that we have to be prepared to say that what we had before was just and reasonable, and that's a real struggle for me.
Sorry, can you repeat that again? Michelle, you were breaking up a little bit as you were speaking.
Oh, sure. The proposal is to keep the existing tariffs in place, but then go back to what we had in 2020 if we don't get something else in place, so it expires. And so then the tariffs that will go into place are the old tariffs. So given that we spent all this time doing this and we're going to bring this to the board sort of on an emergency basis so we get it into place for the summer so that we don't go back, how do we sort of square that with it's okay to go back to that in 2024? That that's a just and reasonable solution.
Yeah, and good question, Michelle. I think, again, we're proposing this on an interim basis, and as we'll talk a little bit more in phase 2 of this presentation, we plan on really focusing on development of this longer-term framework as part of that phase 2 of the initiative, and our full intention is to have that longer-term framework in place in advance of summer of 2024 so that we don't have to find ourselves in this position again of having to seek an extension. That is a thing that we want to avoid. It's a commitment from executive top down that we want to avoid additional extensions of this framework because we recognize the drawbacks of of this interim framework for both California entities as well as external load serving entities, and that's where we plan on focusing on this longer term framework as part of phase 2 to implement it ahead of that summer of 2024.
So just one question then. If we want to prevent having to do an extension, why not just not have it revert in 2024?
Yeah, and I think what you're referring to, Michelle, is kind of an indefinite extension. Is that right? And the concern for us was we didn't necessarily want to give that impression that we're okay with this framework on an indefinite basis. I mean, as you'll hear in phase 2, we're putting forward a aggressive schedule on phase 2 because we feel that there's a need to change this framework and move to that reservation process that better accounts for native load needs while also providing different ways for external entities to access our system. But we felt that an indefinite extension, would not necessarily send that signal that we're committed to this new reservation process that we're working towards. And I think a 2-year extension is really going to keep us on track and give us the time that we need to develop the policy as well as the implementation for that new reservation process.
Okay, thanks a lot. I have a couple of other questions, but I'll wait until after the next part. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
We'll go to the caller in queue, please.
Okay, sure. Caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Chris Devon from Customized Energy Solutions. Can you hear me all right?
Hi, Chris.
Yes.
Yep.
Thanks. I just had a question on the continuing or extending the part of the proposal that requires the high priority wheels to have the firm transmission to the border. Is the CAISO willing to be flexible on that piece at all and maybe remove that requirement, or potentially continue to ask the CPUC to require the same for RA imports? Because it seems like there's a pretty big gap in the treatment or equity or fairness of those different differences in those two different requirements.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, for that question. And we did consider different types of enhancements for next summer, but ultimately what we felt was that we had a particular rationale that supported an extension of this framework, this past filing for summer of 2021, ultimately the extension of this framework is within that rationale. To the extent that we were to remove any of these pieces from that framework, I think it would throw the different concepts out of balance. And if you remove that 45-day ahead requirement, I think it impacts certain of the parallels that we made to the resource adequacy process in that filing. So we felt that the easiest and the quickest thing to provide that certainty for stakeholders, particularly external entities, as they're starting to contract for next summer, was an extension of the existing framework because they are familiar with it, familiar with those rules, changes to that framework subject to FERC approval and the uncertainty that comes with it ahead of next summer. To the extent that FERC were to change certain rules or we were to propose something different, it could impact. If they enter into certain contracts now, but the rules change right on June 1st, it could impact some of those contracts that those parties entered into. So the thought was, let's extend the process that we know and the certainty, provide that certainty under which entities are already starting to contract now. Hopefully that helps a little bit.
Yeah, thanks for the additional color there. I certainly understand the CAISO's perspective on it. I guess it seems to me that perhaps the best solution to this would be that the RA imports would also have to show the firm transmission, in advance as well. But I can also understand why, that maybe wasn't decided, and that may be outside the CAISO's main jurisdiction here, and we're getting into the RA rules. But since they're really both intended to kind of serve the same type of purpose for, serving load needs, in that sense, I do think it could be appropriate for the PUC to reconsider that. But anyhow, I just wanted to make that opinion known here, and with that, I'll wrap up my comments here. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that, Chris. And I think, again, I think within the phase 2, as we're looking at that longer-term transmission reservation process, I think there's certainly room, for considering that. And is there still a need for a transmission requirement into that process? Personally, I think we can. That's a way to avoid that from transmission requirement if we move to that transmission reservation process, depending on how we frame it. But that's for phase 2, where we're going to cover that.
Yeah. Thanks, Milosh. I do think the longer-term reservation framework is really the way to solve a lot of these concerns, and this interim issue is, hopefully resolved by those things. I agree with that. But it does seem to me that it's just unfortunate that we have to have this kind of, I think, just a pretty drastic difference in treatment, in my opinion, for this long of a period now, instead of just only over the prior summer, which, I think some folks had envisioned that it might be able to change sooner in this phase 1 process. But fair enough. Understand the position. So thanks for the feedback.
Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. So we do have another verbal question, and then we have questions in the chat. So we'll go to the person in the queue first.
Sure. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Barbara Senelmore from SRP. Hi, Milosh. I had a question, and maybe you are going to go over these when you go over the timeline for all these. But earlier this summer, when we were doing, or when there was an opportunity to do market simulations for the registration of PT wheels in map stage, there was a lot of issues. CAISO had a lot of issues with software. SRP tried to conduct some market simulations. We attempted to test scenarios. At the time, we were not able to see the expected results. And because there were some software issues, we kind of just put everything on hold, waiting for CAISO to fix those. And once they were fixed, the initiative went into production before external entities were able to retest or conduct any kind of simulations or testing. So I was wondering if CAISO is planning to allow for further market simulations ahead of next summer, just to make sure that the scheduling of the PT wheels is working, and just kind of allow us some peace of mind that it's working from our side and from all sides. And we don't doubt that the software issues have been fixed, but we still would like an opportunity to test it out.
Okay. No, thank you for the question. Let me follow up with our folks on that. I don't see why we couldn't make that available as part of ahead of next summer. But I certainly understand what you're getting at and the concerns, and let me circle back with them, and we'll let you know. Appreciate the suggestion.
Okay. So it doesn't look like we have anybody else in the queue. We do have some chat questions. This is from Carly Page. She asked, administratively, would this mean that CAISO would apply for an extension of the interim program approved in FERC docket ER 21-1790, or would the CAISO be applying for a new 2-year wheeling priorities program at FERC?
Thanks, Carly. Maybe I'll turn it over to Anthony if he can hear us. If you wanted to respond to that one, Anthony, from our legal team.
Just make sure you unmute yourself, Anthony.
Thanks for the reminder, Christina. I started talking while muted. We will be filing basically the same tariff sheets that are in effect now, but we will have to refile them as a new Section 205 filing, because effective June 1 of 2022, the existing tariff sheets would expire. So this is basically a brand new Section 205 filing, although it is extending the provisions that are in place now.
Carly, hopefully that answers your question. Feel free to send follow-up questions in the chat. Okay. looks like we answered it. So I don't see any other questions, Milos, if you want to keep going.
Okay, let's go to the next slide, slide 6. So as part of phase 1, we're also planning to pursue a couple enhancements in the cyber tool to provide some added transparency for high priority exports and designated resources that are supporting those exports. One of the enhancements is the creation of a screen in cyber for generating resources or their scheduling coordinators to be able to view the instantaneous non-RA capacity of the resource. And we hope that this may foster improved communications between the generator owner and the scheduling coordinator for that resource and the exporting parties for that are using that resource to support high priority exports. The second enhancement is in cyber as well, is providing notification to the exporting scheduling coordinators when the sum of the high priority or PT export schedules exceeds the non-RA capacity of that designated supporting resource. Effectively, those parties, those scheduling coordinators that are submitting those high priority export schedules would get a notification in cyber ahead of market close that based on the schedules submitted and the high priority schedules, export schedules submitted with the same identified supporting resource, that those schedules exceed the non-RA capacity of the resource. And this would then, the parties that receive that notice would then have time prior to market close to update those schedules and potentially communicate with the supporting resource owner and be able to resubmit those schedules to be within the non-RA capacity amount of the resource. These enhancements at cyber are really intended to provide some additional transparency to the designated resource as well as the PT export scheduling coordinators to support and foster communication between the parties to avoid submission ultimately of high priority export schedules above the non-RA capacity of the resource. And to the extent that ultimately, despite all of this, to the extent that that continues to occur where the PT export schedules exceed the non-RA capacity, in spite of those notifications and the added visibility, the software then would revert the PT export schedules to low priority status as it's been configured to do thus far. So we're hoping that these enhancements really will, at the front end, provide the information necessary to the designated resource as well as the entities submitting the PT export schedules to ensure that those submissions are within the non-RA capacity of the designated supporting resource. Let me pause here as well if there are any questions on this topic before moving on to the next one.
Yeah, thank you. We do have Michelle back in the queue. So Shreyas, can you open her line?
Sure. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hey, Milos, this is Michelle again from the CPUC. So I just had this question about the non-RA capacity. So hydro capacity, the NQC, the net qualifying capacity, is often less than the PMAX of the facility. It's based on historical production. So imagine that you have a 100 megawatt hydro resource and the NQC is 80 megawatts. It's based on its historical production. So a CPUC entity can't show more than 80 megawatts of that resource. When you guys are doing the non-RA capacity, if that hydro resource is actually producing 100 megawatts, are you calling the 20 megawatts non-RA capacity? Because, you know, anyway.
Thanks, Michelle. Let me maybe turn it over to I don't know, Greg Ford, if you want to jump in and just give a sense of how the software would view that non-RA capacity overall.
Yeah, hi, this is Greg. Michelle, yes, currently to get the non-RA capacity, we're looking at the amount that the resource bids and subtracting out the RA capacity and, if necessary, other things like ancillary services. But I think to answer your question, yes, currently that's considered to be non-RA capacity if they provide a bid above the, I think you said 80 megawatts, like if they provide a bid up to 100, then yes, that would be considered non-RA capacity.
And Greg, is that the same true for wind and solar that he has ELCC values? I could go through an example, but are you saying that the amount above the NQC, which can be 15%, is all non-RA that's exportable with PT?
That's correct. Anything that they provide a bid for that's above the RA value that's in our CIRA system would be non-RA.
Okay, so
this is Brad Cooper. I'd clarify though that what Greg is describing is how the automated notifications in our systems work, but the tariff requirement is that the PT export cannot be from capacity under contract to a California load serving entity. So in your example, the tariff does not allow that amount above the RA QC to be designated as supporting an export.
Okay, but then isn't that confusing that Cyber is going to be telling them that there is available non-RA capacity?
This is Milos. So, go ahead if somebody was going to jump in.
Go ahead, Milos.
Yeah, this is Milos. I was going to note that, our hope is that this provides some added visibility and that ultimately that designated resource owner also takes into account some of the other elements or requirements of the tariff, but when they're selling some of that capacity to other parties that are identifying it as supporting a PT export schedule. So this is really just to provide some level of visibility above what's there today to help inform ultimately how much and could be exported from that resource on high priority, keeping in mind some of the other requirements of the tariff, like Brad said, that amounts above the NQC amount, the tariff is fairly clear that that cannot be supporting high priority exports.
Okay, I will just note then that seems inconsistent to have that information if it's not actually allowed, but thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, I don't see any other questions, Milos.
Okay, let's go to the next slide then. Okay. So we're also putting forward a tariff clarification regarding the expectations of high priority exports supported by variable energy resources. So the current tariff requires that resources that are supporting high priority exports have the necessary capacity to support the export throughout the entirety of the hour. And in the context of variable energy resources, what we're using on this slide as VERs, the tariff notes that this assessment of whether a VER has the capacity to support a high priority export for the entirety of the hour is made at the time of bid submission. And scheduling coordinators, therefore, can submit a PT export schedule, for example, after the close of the day-ahead market, well in advance of the operating hour, based on an outdated forecast, which may overestimate the capacity that's available to support the export for that particular hour, operating hour, for which that high priority export was submitted. The tariff clarification that we will be putting forward sets the expectation that for variable energy resources, the availability of capacity to support the high priority export for the full hour is based upon the most recent output forecast for that operating hour, rather than the forecast at the time of bid submission. The expectation here is that if a party submitted a high priority export self-schedule offer into the real-time market, supported by a VER, even if they did that hours ahead of the operating hour, if that forecast changes, the PT export schedule may need to be updated based on the changes on that in that forecast. So, this is more of a tariff clarification as to what is the concept of the need for the supporting resource to be available or to have sufficient capacity for the entire hour if it's supporting a PT export. What does that mean in the context of variable energy resources? And here we're clarifying that that assessment is not made at the time of bid submission, but rather the ability to use a variable energy resource to support a high priority export should be based or is based upon the most recently available output forecast for the particular hour in which that high priority export is being submitted. Where this arises is out of some comments that the DMM submitted in the comments to the issue paper, where they've essentially made a similar suggestion here that the concept of availability at the time of bid submission, if the capacity is available at the time of bid submission, may really overestimate the availability of capacity for variable energy resources because that bid could be submitted well in advance of the operating hour, even soon after the close of the day-ahead market, hours ahead of that particular operating hour. So let me see here if we can pause for questions, and we'll be sharing the proposed language. It was shared in the draft final proposal, but it will also be shared once we get into the tariff review section of this presentation.
Sure. Again, if you have a question, you can select the hand icon above the chat window if you're on WebEx. If you dialed in, press #2 on your phone, or you're welcome to send your question in the chat. I'm not seeing any questions, Milos.
Okay. Let's then go to the next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to cover the next two slides together, and then we'll pause for questions there as well, kind of wrapping up phase one of the presentation. We're also proposing to move forward with a number of the transparency enhancements that were requested by stakeholders, either in comments to the July 13th workshop or in the September comments to the issue paper. But stakeholders requested and a number of enhancements, and we've acted on a number of these. Stakeholders requested, for example, that we publicly post and make available aggregate data on high priority exports, high priority wheels that are registered through that 45-day ahead process. These are the wheels or wheeling transactions that meet that 45-day in advance requirement and secure that high priority equal to ISO load for the duration of the month. And we posted that data back in late September of this year on our website, and we've announced this via market notice, but we've posted a spreadsheet that it's a running and live document that anytime we get a high priority wheeling registration, we'll update that spreadsheet and it will identify in aggregate the amount of wheels that have been registered for a particular month across import and export, particular import and export points. And we're committed to continuing to update this list as we receive new registrations for seeking this treatment. We also committed to publish aggregate resource adequacy import data at different tie points. This would provide additional transparency and help stakeholders in considering approaches to wheeling through the ISO system in different ways that they may utilize. But a couple of weeks back, at the same time or in the same day that we published this draft final proposal, we also published historical aggregated RA import data at tie points on our system. This is historical data that I believe covers January 2020 through December of 2021, so effectively 2 years. And it's based on monthly RA showings, historical monthly RA showings, and that data has been aggregated by tie point. We also plan to publish data on a going forward basis on RA import, aggregated RA import showings at different tie points. There are system enhancements as part of other initiatives like the MIC Enhancements Initiative that will be in place later in 2022, some of the automation for this. But in the meantime, we'll be looking to publish some of this data on a more manual basis going forward based on the most recent monthly RA plans. This is a manual process, and we're working on figuring out how best to streamline this on a monthly basis to publish that going forward data ahead of those system enhancements. But we published that historical data, and we're looking to, as well, more manually publish going forward data until those other enhancements, system enhancements, become available that will automate that publication. We'll also be looking to publish the RUC load forecast adjustments. We currently publish the day-ahead load forecast, but we do not publish the adjustments that may be made to those forecasts or those adjusted forecasts. So we'll be looking to make this information accessible on our OASIS, and this does require certain system enhancements that we will be working on and we will implement ahead of June of next year, ahead of summer. And then finally, we're also going to be looking to publish curtailment data on OASIS. Today, while we do publish curtailments or adjustments data, we do so largely after the fact, whether it's in biweekly, monthly, or ad hoc reports. So over the summer, we outlined this in the issue paper in September, but over the summer, in our monthly summer reports, we published robust analysis and data on curtailment that impacted high priority, low priority transactions, particularly exports. And we'll be looking to publish this curtailment data on OASIS that would include curtailment data on high priority, low priority transactions, whether those are wheels or exports, as well as ISO load transactions. And this would be in aggregate form at the different import-export points across the system, that we would make this curtailment data available soon after it occurs, kind of in real time. And we would be looking at doing this based on either curtailments or adjustments that occur in RUC or in HAS, including the post-HAS process. So with the proposed extension of the wheeling through priorities, we do recognize that even more now this information is needed, and the information is helpful to stakeholders, so we're committed to providing that information ahead of next summer. And like I said, we're able to publish on those first two elements that did not require system enhancements. We were able to publish that data this year at different points, and the other two elements that do require system enhancements, we're committed to providing that ahead of next June. Let's go to the next slide, and then we'll pause for questions after that. So to touch a little bit on the phase one timeline for the moment, on January 7th, stakeholder comments are due on this draft final proposal. And on January 14th, we haven't yet announced it, but plan on doing so this week. We'll be scheduling a tariff call or draft tariff language review call with stakeholders to review and any updated tariff language based upon stakeholder comments that we may get on the draft tariff language that Anthony's going to share a little bit later with you today. So we'll be on the lookout for a market notice on this later this week. We're also going to be taking this draft final proposal to a special session of the ISO Board of Governors and the EIM governing body meeting that's been scheduled for January 20th. There's a market notice, I believe, that went out last week on that meeting date and time. And to the extent this proposal ultimately is approved by the ISO Board of Governors, we're going to promptly submit a FERC filing in January. And again, this, I think, follows that theme of we're looking to provide some of this certainty going into next summer. That's why we're pursuing a special session of the board, as well as filing promptly with FERC to the extent that this proposal is approved, so that we can provide that certainty well in advance of summer. If we were to wait to March to make such a filing, to go to the board in March, as was originally planned for phase one of the initiative, and then submit a filing to FERC later in March, the timeline would just be fairly tight, and the uncertainty of, ahead of June of next year, whether the framework is extended or not. So we wanted to file it as soon as possible here, and that's why we're doing it through a special session in January, so that we can provide that certainty going into next summer as early as possible. Okay, let's pause then here on phase one questions, including the last couple of topics I covered here. Next, where we're going to go next is an informational update on phase 2 of the initiative. So let's pause here for any questions.
And just if you're in WebEx, select the hand icon of the chat window. If you dialed in, press #2, or you can send your question in the chat. I'm just going to give it a moment. It looks like Michelle has her hand raised, so if you can go ahead and go to her line, please.
Sure. Please go ahead. The line is unmuted.
Hey, this is Michelle. So this is just my last question with regard to the wheeling transactions, and it's somewhat similar to my other question about the July 9th. Let's see, wheels have to be paired, but if you lose an import line after the HASP process, is there nothing you can do? So I guess I'm asking, can wheels only get cut in the HASP process, and then after the HASP, even if you lose the import leg, CAISO still needs to support the export if that occurs after the HASP process? Likewise, is that the same for, like, let's say a PT export that you lose after the HASP process, that you still have to support the export? Is that correct? I've been struggling with this.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Let me see if I can turn over to Brad to help me with this one as well. Or Guillermo, I think, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, this is Brad. I think we should look into the specific rules before we answer it. There might be some nuance that I don't know offhand.
Okay. I guess I'll follow up on a sidebar then.
Milos, looks like you're talking on mute.
Sorry, yeah, let me see if Guillermo has anything to add here. I think he wants to jump in.
Thank you, Milos. Hi, Michelle. I think there are different permutations, and I don't know if you're trying to cover one specific extreme case or in general any scenario. In general, we have to caveat this because we are talking about July 9, that is before we implemented the summer enhancements. The logic, not the logic, but the priorities change after August 4th. So we are really talking about pre-summer enhancements logic and priorities. Prior to that is no longer in place and is not what we expect to have for the upcoming summer. At that time, the wheels have higher priority than the CAISO load and the individual exports, just because of the way we pair the import and the export that make up the transaction of the wheel. And that is effectively one of the changes that we implemented in the summer to ensure that when they come through the system, now they are going to have the same priority as the CAISO load. So we have to recognize that July 9, even though it was a production case that we faced, it was under the old paradigm. Under the current paradigm, we are going to have that the priority of the exports and the wheels are going to have effectively the same priority as the CAISO load. Now, when we're in a situation, assuming we would have the same conditions of July 9 under the new paradigm of the summer enhancements, what is going to happen is that if we're in a situation where we have to decide what to do, either cutting the exports, the wheels, or the CAISO load, it's based on the new set of priorities. And in this case, the exports are not going to be above the CAISO load. So it may very well happen that now when we're in a such tight supply condition, we may very well end up reducing the wheels because now they are at the same level field of the CAISO load. So that is going to be a difference with respect to what we actually observed on July 9. Now,
so Guillermo, maybe.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was blanking. Now, based on the condition that we may be dealing with, it depends how far we have to go into the bit stack to determine whether the condition is going to be addressed by reducing exports, by reducing wheels, or relaxing the power balance. When there is a condition in which we have to reduce the corresponding import of the wheel on the, let's say, Malin intertie, the market is going to be able to do that reduction concurrent with the reduction of the exports, because we enforce these wheeling transactions, so they have to clear imbalance. That is what the market is going to do. I think one of your questions is more about after the fact.
So I guess, well, actually, my first question, Guillermo, is which market? So which market cuts the exports if the wheeling, if they cut the exports if the imports don't show up? Is that only in HASP, or do you do it in FMM and RTD?
No, it's only IFM, ROC, or HASP. Only the 15-minute resources that can be in the 15-minute market can be economically or optimized in the 15-minute market, but the majority of the transactions we have are hourly transactions. So the last opportunity for the market to effectively implement those reductions is HASP. If anything else happens after HASP, that is going to move more into the manual curtailments that have to be implemented by operators.
Okay. So the only time that you can make these cuts is HASP, but HASP occurs like 75 minutes before the hour?
Yeah, it starts to trigger 75 minutes before, yes.
Okay, so to the extent that you lose a transmission line or you have a forced outage, we would still have to support the exports that were cleared at HASP. Is that right?
If we are talking about, well, depends what conditions you are dealing with. If we are talking about like the condition that we faced on July 9th, in which we reduced the Malin intertie, we reduced and had a series of import schedules coming through the Malin. If there were any wheel transactions that have to be cut, they would be cut in a balanced way, imports and exports, whatever the export is going to be. I think your question is more about the individual exports. If now there were exports that were clear based on the assumption of the issue that we have of July 9 of overscheduling, when we have cut effectively the imports, we didn't go and cut accordingly additional exports to keep the balance, right? Because there was no tracking on that. Right. I would say that was in part not because of the priorities that we have, but because of the issue of the overscheduling that we had, and that is the issue that we're addressing to have in place before the next summer.
Okay, I guess I would. Okay, and then okay. I think I've got it. So the last time that you can do something in the market is HASP, so that anything that occurs after T-minus 75 it has to be a manual intervention if you do anything. But there is potentially risk that you could be supporting exports that are not supportable if you have a forced outage in the line.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I do not see any other callers in the queue as of now. Milos, I think you're on mute.
Okay, sorry, my phone just dropped, so I had to call back in. Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, we can.
All right, sorry about that. Thank you. Okay, phase 2. Let's just go to the next slide. Okay, so we also wanted to provide an informational update on phase 2 today of the initiative, which is really focused on the development of that longer-term framework, a transmission reservation process to facilitate wheeling through the ISO system. And towards the end of the section, I'm also going to cover an updated timeline for phase 2. But as part of phase 2 of this initiative, we introduced stakeholder working groups. And the reason we did that is that we felt it was important to hear about the practices across the West to supplement what we already heard from some of the other ISOs and RTOs and the ISO's benchmarking of them. We're going to provide an opportunity for stakeholders as well to share ideas and perspectives through these working groups to ultimately help us inform a proposal. We launched the first of these working groups back in November, Working Group 1, that was focused on the calculation of ATC, or available transfer capability, and the transmission capacity then that can be set aside for native load needs to reliably serve those native load needs. I'm going to focus a couple of slides on that particular working group here next, just to kind of provide a high-level overview of some of the things that we've heard and some of the things that we'll need to consider as we're applying this to the ISO. But the other two working groups will be launching in January, and we will issue a market notice with some of those dates later this week. We're still coordinating with certain entities to be able to present, to make sure that they're able to present some of their practices at those meetings. But these are not as formalized working groups with facilitators as some of the EDAM working groups that you may have heard about. But really here, what we're focused in these working groups is on information sharing and fostering some of the ideas and hearing from some of those other transmission providers across the West to ultimately help us inform an ISO proposal. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is more focused now on Working Group 1, and I'm going to be sharing a bit of insights into how the ISO may consider certain aspects of this topic as we're continuing to think about it internally. And in the discussions of Working Group 1 that we've had now in November and December, I think we had a total of 6 meetings. We heard from the transmission providers or the transmission functions of Idaho Power Company, BPA, and SRP, where they shared their practices and how they calculate ATC, or the available transfer capability, and ultimately how they derive the native load needs as an existing transmission commitment when calculating that ATC. And I think that on the next slide, I have a graphic that I think is going to help put this a little bit more into context, but I want to talk about some of the higher points at this stage. The overarching practices across these entities, I believe, are largely consistent. Where the differences lie between them is in some of the nuances and the different assumptions, as we touched on a little bit in the draft final proposal, that ultimately inform how native load needs are derived. And this is also consistent with how native load needs and ATC are derived by other ISOs and RTOs with a transmission service reservation process based on the benchmarking that we did earlier this year. Transmission capacity can be set aside for native load needs or network load. I think load in general in a balancing authority area as an existing transmission commitment prior to making transmission available for reservation or for sale as ATC. And this amount of transmission that is set aside for native load needs really depends upon load and generation assumptions. There's discretion in these assumptions, and there's not a singular set of assumptions or that apply industry-wide. Rather, these assumptions are unique to the particular system and the realities of that system and the different loads on that system. To the extent the system depends largely on hydro generation, for example, whether it's summer or winter peaking, the different realities and the reliability needs across that system all inform ultimately those assumptions and the information that the transmission provider utilizes to derive an amount of transmission capacity that needs to be set aside for native load needs. And I'm going to touch on that, like I said, a little bit on the next slide in just a second. But we also learned that there's discretion in setting aside transmission capacity across the different margins that are part of the ATC methodology and some of those margins that are recognized by NERC standards, namely the capacity benefit margin as well as the transmission reliability margin. We learned through those discussions that some transmission providers set aside transmission capacity under one or both of those margins to further foster reliability and ensure reliable service to their native loads, while others may choose not to use those margins based upon the level of confidence that they have that sufficient transmission has been set aside for native load needs based on the robustness of the assumptions of the different scenarios that they may run and the needs that are covered in some of those existing transmission commitments, ensuring that they can meet those existing commitments and the different uncertainties and reliability scenarios that they may run. So I think the theme here is that there's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all into the different components and the use of the CBM and TRM margins in particular, but also not a one-size-fits-all assessment of inputs in calculating native load needs. But I think this varies by transmission provider and the different realities and conditions of their system that they may need to account for. Let's go to the next slide and illustrate this a little bit more. This is going to get slightly technical, but particularly for the entities that are not necessarily familiar with the methodology, but I just wanted to illustrate the elements we will need to consider when determining the native load needs and ultimately deriving the amount of transmission or the ATC that can be made available for reservation. So, this is a high-level representation of the ATC methodology. That ATC or the available transfer capability is derived by calculating the total transfer capability and subtracting across a particular path or a flow gate, and then subtracting any kind of existing transmission commitments that may exist across those paths or flow gates, as well as subtracting any of those margins, the CBM or the TRM. And the methodology also accounts for counterflows and any kind of postbacks or releases of transmission. But these are the key components, that the ones I have on this slide are really the key components of that methodology. And, the way that, or where the native load component within this methodology lives is within the existing transmission commitments bucket that you see on the slide here. The existing transmission commitments today under the ISO's ATC methodology, ETC stands for existing transmission contracts, primarily because that is really the only thing that we account for under the ETC component of the methodology, just those existing transmission contracts, because the ISO does not necessarily set aside or separately calculate the transmission capacity that is set aside to serve native load needs. But in the overall ATC methodology, ETC stands for existing transmission commitments. Native load needs or network load needs are one component. The other component are those existing transmission contracts that you need to honor. And then there may be other commitments that need to be honored, pre-existing arrangements or other reservations as time goes on that needs to be treated as an existing transmission commitment. So I just want to focus on a little bit on this native load component of the existing transmission commitments element of the methodology, because that is really where the accounting and the setting aside of transmission capacity for native load needs is within the ETC component. And so what we've heard both from in Working Group 1 from transmission providers across the West, but also what we've heard from the other ISOs and RTOs that have a transmission reservation process is that they calculate native load needs within the existing transmission commitments component. And they do so by looking at load and generation assumptions. The load assumptions and generation assumptions ultimately come together to form and to identify, based on those different assumptions, what is the amount of transmission capacity that needs to be set aside to serve the native load needs. On the load component side, the question is, what type of, what is the native load that needs to be accounted for and that transmission capacity needs to be set aside for? And what we've heard from some of the transmission providers across the West, for example, is that, some of them may utilize 1 in 20 peak forecasts. Some of them may utilize 1 in 10 peak forecasts. Some of them may utilize 1 in 2 non-coincidental peak forecasts. But ultimately, the question here is, what is the load forecast that is utilized to calculate those native load commitments. And that load forecast may be different across different time horizons where the ATC is being calculated. You know, the load forecast in the long-term horizon, when you're calculating ATC on a long-term basis for a year or longer, you know, can be different potentially and maybe less conservative, or could be the same as the load forecast that's utilized for deriving ATC or the native load needs in the shorter term time frames, less than a year time frames when you're calculating short-term ATC. And so what we'll need to consider for our purposes of the ISO is ultimately what is the nature of that load forecast that is capturing those native load needs across the different time horizons. What is the appropriate load forecast? And is it different from the long-term horizon to the shorter-term horizon? Similarly, on the generation side, the generation assumption side, those generation assumptions inform ultimately, you know, how the forecasted load is served, depending on the forecast that's utilized, and that derives the transmission capacity on a path-by-path or flow gate-by-flow gate basis that needs to be set aside. And those generation assumptions, what we've heard from other transmission providers, you know, are informed by different things. They're informed by resources that may be already under contract. They may be informed by forecasted resources that are not yet under contract, but the parties, you know, or the load serving entity, the native loads are planning on using to serve that load across different horizons. And we would need to consider the same here in how this applies to the ISO. We would need to consider what are the appropriate generation assumptions that would need to be utilized to pair against those load forecasts to derive ultimately the transmission capacity. Is it, you know, integrated resource plans that help provide some of that information, particularly in the longer term time frames? Is it the resource adequacy plans and to what extent they play a role in calculating or identifying those generation assumption needs? And again, this may vary from the long-term to the short-term horizon. Is it historical dispatch patterns? You know, because in the market, ultimately, while there may be resource adequacy resources that are shown in our rate plans, those are offered into the market. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're awarded or dispatched to serve load, that there may be non-RA generation that as well as that's offered in the market that is dispatched to serve load. So is that something that we're looking at, those historical dispatch patterns or, you know, resources? And then are there any other assumptions that may need to be considered? But this is all just to give an illustration of some of the things that we'll need to think about as we're looking to how does the ISO derive the native load needs across its system and across the different time horizons. That's where I think stakeholder input will be important as we consider best how to derive those native load needs. And then separately from that is obviously the capacity benefit margin and the transmission reliability margin components. Let's go to the next slide then, and then I think, let's see how many more we have. I think we have a couple more, and then we'll pause for questions. But I wanted to touch on and acknowledge some of the other key elements of the framework that we'll need to consider ahead of sharing the schedule on the next slide for phase 2. And some of these elements here will be discussed as part of the upcoming working groups 2 and 3 that we'll be scheduling. But the key one that we just covered here, I think, is deriving the amount of transmission that is available for reservation, the ATC across the different time horizons, long-term and short-term, whether it's over a year or less than a year. And this requires, as I noted, deriving the native load needs and then consideration of some of the different margins, the CBM and the TRM. Another key element is ultimately identifying the transmission product or products and the associated qualities of those products. So in order, for example, to support wheeling through reservations across our system and to establish that higher scheduling priority, is a firm transmission product sufficient, or is there a need for a non-firm product as well? or if a wheel through does not reserve transmission in advance, that it can, still be allowed to offer into the market, but it's just a lower priority? Or is there a different framework here that needs to be considered? But those are some of the questions that we're going to need to answer when thinking about the transmission products or products that will need to be considered. We also, I think, need to discuss the time frame of the product or products to minimize seams issues with the OAT framework. We think this is a key element here as well in addressing the seams issues. Under the OAT framework, there's the ability to reserve transmission across different time frames, both long-term and short-term. And then there's different time frames within that short-term element, which is monthly, weekly, daily, and some transmission provider, even though it's a non-pro forma product, some may even offer hourly firm service. But the idea here is to minimize those seams issues. I think we will need to consider, are we offering those products across those same or similar time horizons so that they can pair, a reservation and establish a higher scheduling priority across those same time horizons if they're weaving through the ISO system. And then we're going to need to consider as well and discuss some of the other qualities of the product or products. Which transmission products are eligible for congestion revenue right allocation? As we noted in our benchmarking efforts that we outlined in the issue paper in September, across the other ISOs and RTOs, to the extent that somebody reserves long-term firm transmission, they're also eligible for CRR allocations. I think one of the other entities also allowed CRR allocations for monthly firm transmissions. But that's something we'll need to consider as well. And then can the transmission that's reserved, can that be resold to another party? And are there any other nuances here that may arise that we will need to consider that need to be addressed? Another component then is the transmission studies and expansion. They're also an important component of the overall transmission reservation framework. To the extent an entity wants long-term certainty, for example, wants firm long-term service by a year or longer or whatever time frame we ultimately identify, and then want to establish that higher scheduling priority across that longer-term time frame, allowing the ability to create a process for studying those needs to the extent there is not, that ATC is not available, to study those needs and potentially, those types of requests driving transmission upgrades, or at least driving consideration of an upgrade to the extent that entity wants to participate and pursue that upgrade. And then the associated financial or funding criteria to pursue a particular upgrade. Another key component or key aspect here is the integration with our transmission planning process that's currently in place. And then, finally, I think based on the products and the qualities of those transmission products in place, we would need to identify the appropriate rate or compensation structure for that reserved transmission, recognizing that there may be one or more products for transmission across the system. These are not easy tasks by any means or concepts, but we think these are necessary to consider and to address as part of development of a transmission reservation process. Okay, let's go then to the next slide, and I think then we'll pause for questions here. I just wanted to walk through this informational update, put the information kind of in the larger context, and then cover the timeline, and we'll pause for questions after this slide. And let me acknowledge here, in terms of the timeline on this slide, that it's slightly different than the timeline in the document that we posted a couple of weeks back. It's been updated. The timeline has been updated. We had an opportunity to hear from some of the stakeholder feedback on other efforts and recognizing the need for some more lead time for a straw proposal, which pushed out the timeline by a couple of months. But we will look to start with a straw proposal at the end of the April timeframe of next year of 2022. Maybe I'll refer to it as April, because if I say next year, it sounds too far away. But in April, And then we'll have an opportunity to evaluate the discussions in these working groups. There will be, we had some of those discussions in working group 1. We'll have discussions in working groups 2 and 3 on different aspects that will help educate us and give us things to consider for this draft proposal. But also, I think it gives us April timeframe, gives us an opportunity to develop a more comprehensive proposal on the different elements of a reservation process. And I'll reiterate here as well that a transmission reservation process is new to the ISO. We don't have necessarily the infrastructure, and as you heard, we don't necessarily have some of the components of that APC methodology in place, like the native load needs component that we will need to consider. So a number of these aspects are new to us, and we're hoping to leverage, again, through those working groups, some of the practices and learn from the practices of our partners across the West to help inform ultimately a proposal here. And then we'll go through our iterative proposal process, based on stakeholder input and feedback. We'll issue additional revised proposals and ultimately target a draft final proposal in the October timeframe and presentation to the Board of Governors and the EIM governing body in December, with implementation, again, ahead of that June 2024 timeframe. Really the complexity, I think, of the reservation process that we develop as we go through the different iterations of proposal and the discussion with stakeholders will give us a sense if we're able to maybe implement some of this earlier than that summer of 2024, which we certainly hope that we can do. But the hope here is that if we can finish this policy design in 2022, we can make a FERC filing soon thereafter and, really get working on the implementation aspects ahead of that summer of 2024. And like I said, we may be able to, depending on the complexity, we may be able to implement some of this framework earlier if possible. But it also allows us then time to really put stakeholders, identify that framework, file it with FERC, and stakeholders, external entities will have some notice as to what that new framework is so that they can properly then plan ahead and make any kind of adjustments that they need to as they contract for future summers. I think as we go through this process, we'll reevaluate this timeline as we go along, but we recognize really the need to move swiftly through this set of complex issues. And we hope that we can leverage, like I said, some of the working groups and with your help, put together a more comprehensive straw proposal in the April timeframe. Okay, let's pause here for questions. Next after this is a review of the draft tariff language for phase 1 that we covered a bit earlier in the presentation today that Anthony's going to walk us through. But let's pause here if there are any questions on anything I may have mentioned as part of phase 2 of this effort.
We do have one person in the queue, but just as a reminder, you can click on the hand icon above the chat window if you're in WebEx, press #2 if you dialed in only, or you can send your question in the chat. So Shreyas, let's go ahead and go to Ian.
Okay, sure. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, Milos. Ian White with Shell Energy. I just was curious on the timeline. See, we're targeting for phase 2 a late December 2022 filing before the FERC. How come the ISO is contemplating an implementation in 2024? It seems to me that seems like 18 months from a final FERC filing to implementation seems a bit long. So I was just curious what your thinking was in not implementing it earlier in potentially in 2023 or early 2024.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Thanks, Ian, for the question. And I think it gets back to, the timeline here that we laid out, particularly on the implementation side, is really intended to be as late as, to the extent that some of this lends itself to that this framework lends itself to an earlier implementation, we would certainly share that with stakeholders and receive feedback. But, the goal was to give us some time for implementation, recognizing, as I said, that this is a new and complex process to the ISO, we will be creating a new reservation process and new software and new systems to be able to administer that type of a reservation process. But the other element is time plan, as well as providing sufficient notice to entities that the framework is changing so they can inform their contracting. We're hoping that if we can finish this design process in December and file it with FERC, and FERC soon thereafter, within 2 to 3 months, I think it's usually the usual time frame for hearing back from them. But if they approve it, then external entities will be on, will have a certainty of what that new framework is, and it will help inform their contracting ahead of that summer of 2024. So it's a bit of a dual approach of providing certainty, enough notice to entities of a change framework to help inform contracting and not change the rules and implement things at the last second that can potentially impact certain contracts that they may have in place. But it's also giving us some additional time for implementation, recognizing that this is a new process that has to integrate with our other processes. And at this stage, we haven't yet put a proposal in front, but we just want to be, make sure that we have enough time here to consider, based on the complexity of the framework, that there is enough time for us to make that implementation. And as I said, if the timeline lends itself to earlier implementation, we certainly want to share that with stakeholders as we go through this process, that, again, depending on the complexity of the framework. And we'll know more after, we go through, probably we'll have a better sense of that after the initial STRA proposal on this phase 2 in the April timeframe. We'll have a better sense of the complexity after we get some of the feedback from stakeholders that could allow us to consider an earlier timeline for implementation. But at this point in time, we just wanted to make sure that there was enough time and the expectations were set that we anticipate this to be a complex implementation, but also providing time for putting parties on notice of a new changing framework. So hopefully that helps.
That's helpful. Thank you. I do think that it makes sense for that summer period, just to make sure that if we can implement at least by that date, if not before, it makes a lot of sense to signal to the greater market what the intent is now. So that makes sense. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a good holiday.
You too. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see anybody else in the queue. Let me check the chat real quick. All right, I don't see any other questions. So we can go ahead. Anthony, let me go ahead and pull up the tariff language. Hold on one second.
Yeah, and Christina, we'll turn it to Anthony, then we can come back if anybody thinks of any questions before we adjourn and go to the next steps. We can answer any additional questions after this portion of the presentation.
And can you confirm you can see the tariff language?
Yes, we can see it. You may want to zoom in a little bit.
Will do. Anthony, you there?
Yep.
I heard you. Is it big enough? You can see it okay?
Yeah, how about a little slightly larger?
Okay, hold on one second. Oops. The sharing bar is in my way. Here we go. How's that?
That's perfect.
Okay.
Okay, before we get started, again, as Milos and Anna did, I want to thank everybody for taking the time today to participate in the stakeholder meeting. I certainly appreciate over the years all the comments we receive on tariff language, and it's been very helpful in making our tariff, I think, crisper and clearer. So I encourage folks both today in your written comments on the 7th and at our scheduled meeting on the 14th to provide any suggested edits or comments on the tariff language. Again, I think my goal is to have the clearest language possible that we can have. Today, I'm going to really go over two types of tariff language. One There's the sort of what's new language. There's, a few tweaks and a couple of new items that we're adding. I will highlight those. The second category is sort of the interim tariff language that we will be extending, and I will highlight each of these categories as we walk through. We're going to start off first with the tariff language that would be in effect from June 1, 2022 through May 31st, 2024. And when I'm done with that batch, I will stop and take questions, and then we will put on the screen the language that would be in effect starting June 1, 2024, provided we don't have something in place, the long-term solution in place by then, which is certainly our goal. So I'm going to start off with Section 30.5.1, and we'll start off with Section Z. This is an extension of the existing interim tariff language. There are some word tweaks here, though, and specifically we took out the references to the timelines for July and August of 2021, since those deadlines have already passed. So it will basically be a 45-day timeline for everything going forward, which is consistent with the interim proposal after the months of July and August of this year. So if you want to move down to item AA, and if you could carry over the edit to the next page, perfect. This sentence in 30.5.1 AA is to deal with the underproduction of VERS discussion that Milos talked about earlier. And we're just revising one sentence here to make it clear that this should be based on the most recent forecast for the applicable hour and not the forecast at the time of bid submission. So that's the one substantive change there. Let's move on to item 30.5.1 EE. And here we are correcting what I believe was an inadvertent error on our part with the original tariff language. I think the wording, as we looked at this again, we think the wording should have been regarding non-RA exports, not wheeling throughs, because we're trying to make it clear that if you're scheduling an import and an export, that needs to be scheduled as a wheeling through transaction, not an export transaction. So we're clarifying that language here, and again, I think correcting a prior error that we made in our tariff language. Let's go down now to Section 31.4. The edits, 2 points here. The red line edits that we have here are basically the interim tariff language being extended. I also want to note that any language in here that's in gray is language that's in our pending compliance filing that FERC has not acted on yet. And that compliance filing, amongst other things, set forth the penalty parameter prices. So anything you see in gray is basically pending tariff language that FERC hasn't acted on yet. Let's go down to Section 31.5.5. And again, this the one sentence here was added with the interim tariff language. Again, it's something we would be continuing after June 1 of 2022, so hence the red line. Let's move to 34.12.1. Again, the red lines here reflect tariff language, the extension of tariff language that FERC approved on an interim basis. So we will just be extending that come June 1 of next year. Let's go to item 34.12.3. Again, this is tariff language that we are, interim tariff language that we would be extending come June 1. I do want to identify 2 word tweaks, though. And if you look at our straw proposal at page 22, this addresses some comments from SVP regarding use of the term load. And instead of CAISO load, we're going to be using the terminology load within the CAISO balancing authority area. And we've got that in 2 places in this section. And again, you can see the discussion of that at page 22 of the straw proposal. And again, this is in response to some comments from SVP. Lastly, the definition of priority wheel through, we would be keeping the existing interim definition and extending it effective June 1, 2022. So those are the edits that we would have for, again, June 2022 through June 1, 2024. And I will stop now and see if anybody has any questions regarding this. And again, you'll have an opportunity in your written comments on the straw proposal to also provide any edits or comments on the tariff language, and I encourage you to do that as well.
Okay, we'll stop and see if anybody has any questions. Again, you're welcome to send your questions in the chat as well. All right, I don't see any questions, Anthony. I'm going to go ahead and pull up.
Yeah, let's pull up June 1, 2024.
Okay. Can you see it?
Yes. And this is much more straightforward. So basically here, we would be eliminating all of the language that would be placed into effect on an interim basis. So it's basically all of the wording that affects the priority wheeling throughs. And basically we're following what we did in this past summer's tariff amendment filing for what language would be eliminated starting June 1, 2022. So it basically follows that. So I can quickly walk through which sections we would be taking out of the tariff. That would start with 30.5.1Z. It would include the redlined language in 31.4. Again, I note here any language that's highlighted is pending language from the compliance filing. In 31.5.5, we would be eliminating the one sentence that was added there. In 34.12.1, we would be eliminating, again, anything that has to do with priority wheel through tariff language. In 34.
Actually, I'm sorry to interrupt here. I can hear some background noise, so if you can please mute your line if you're not speaking, that would be really helpful. Thank you. Please proceed.
Okay. On 34.12.3, we'd be eliminating the post-haste process. And lastly, we would be deleting the Appendix A definition of priority wheeling through. So this is, again, is the tariff language that would go into effect June 1, 2024. If for some reason we're unable to have a replacement in effect at that time. But as Milos said, our goal is to make sure we have something in effect by June 1, 2024 at the latest. So hopefully this tariff language would not be going into effect. And I will stop there and take any questions on that.
Okay. Again, if you're in WebEx, select the hand icon above the chat window. If you dialed in, press #2 or send your question in the chat. I am not seeing any questions, Anthony.
Okay. Well, again, I want to thank everybody for your time, and please take a look at the tariff language. And if you've got any comments or edits, be sure to include them in your comments on January the 7th. And I hope everybody has a great holiday season and gets a chance to take some time off and enjoy yourself. And stay safe, everybody.
Thank you, Anthony. So any comments from the panelists or the speakers before I go over the next steps?
Yeah, this is Milos. Christina, I'll again extend our gratitude and thanks to everybody that was able to join the call today. We really appreciate you joining us in light of the holidays these next couple of weeks. As you heard today, we're really committed to getting clarity as soon as possible for summer of 2022, and that's why you're seeing us pursue a special session for a decision of the ISO Board of Governors and EM governing body in January of this year, of 2022, and so that we can provide that certainty going into the summer of 2022. And we would file this as soon as we get a decision on that January meeting. And then we would implement the necessary processes as soon as practical, depending on the complexity of the framework, in support of reservations by summer of 2024. So we're really committed to moving along on phase one and dedicating our resources and our attention, hopefully your attention as well, on phase two to help us develop this reservation process. And we certainly look forward to working with you on this complex issue and challenging issue, but we're up for the task. So thank you again, everybody, for taking the time. We really appreciate it. We look forward to your comments, and I'll turn it over to you, Christina.
Sure. Hopefully you see the slide okay. So yeah, just as far as next steps for the phase one items, we are looking for written comments on the draft final proposal and the draft tariff language that's posted. Those are going to be due by end of day, January 7th. We will be posting a comment template for you to use. That should be up definitely by tomorrow, end of day. And then, as Milos mentioned, for the for phase one, with the final proposal, we will go to a special session of the Board of Governors. That's scheduled on January 20th. There will be a notice with the details for that meeting coming out fairly soon. And then as far as the phase two items, we are going to be kicking off the working groups 2 and 3 in January. So I will be issuing a notice with the dates for those meetings as well as the participation details. And then if we do get comments for the draft tariff language, as Milos mentioned, we're going to host another call January 14th. We haven't noticed that call yet, but we are planning. We have that call tentatively scheduled to do a draft tariff language review. So that is all I have. Any other questions or comments before we conclude the call today? Oops, sorry. Okay, thank you, Milos. So Milos mentioned that the notice for the January 20th board meeting was already published, so sorry about that. So I don't see anybody in the queue. Thank you again for participating. We greatly appreciate it. If you're involved in the Resource Efficiency Initiative, we are hosting a call tomorrow morning to review the revised draft final proposal. That's from 10 to noon tomorrow. So thank you again. I hope you all have a great rest of your day. And if I don't talk to you for the holidays, so we all wish you a happy holiday. Take care.